All right, so today we will be looking at Machinal by Sophie Treadwell and As Is by William Hoffman. If you are unaware of the story of As Is, here is a summary that briefly explains what it's about. The time is now, the place is New York City. Rich, a young writer who is beginning to find success, is breaking up with his longtime lover, Sal, a professional photographer. The split is particularly difficult for Sal, who still loves Rich deeply, but the mood is one of bantering and ironic humor as they divide their belongings. However, Rich's happiness with his new lover is short-lived when he learns that he has AIDS, and returns to the good-hearted Sal for sanctuary as he awaits its slow and awful progress. Thereafter, the action is comprised of a mosaic of brilliantly conceived short scenes, some profoundly moving, some brightly humorous, which capture the pathos of Rich's relationship with friends and family, the cold impersonality of the doctors and nurses who care for him, and the widely diverse aspects of the New York's gay community, for which Rich's plight is chilling reminder of their own peril. In the end, the effect of the play is emotionally overwhelming, an honest and unsparing examination of a deeply felt human relationship shattered by a mindless, destructive force which cannot be tempered or turned aside. Now we're going to be taking a closer look at the style that each of these shows was written in. I came to the conclusion that As Is was a piece of expressionism as well as epic theater, and I think upon closer examination of Machinal, although we talked about it as a form of expressionism, I think it also falls under this idea of epic theater. But I found this post from the Washington Post. It was a review of the show in 1987 that explained that Hoffman's expressionistic script had several instances when the rage and pain are momentarily diffused by a gesture of solidarity. So even back then, when the show debuted, people were seeing it as this expressionistic type of show. And I chose to look at it under this lens because I also believe this as well as looking at it as epic theater. So when it comes to expressionism, I took a look back at what we had decided was the style and makeup of expressionism theater back then. And we talked about in class with Mackinac, as you can see on the left, that it had all of these that made up this show that created this expressionistic idea of the play. But on the right, you can see that I don't have them all included here because not all of them were included in this. So with deliberate distortions in the nightmarish effect we see in this show, right when he is diagnosed with AIDS, there's a swarm of doctors that come on the stage, and all of his family members come on the stage as well. And they start swirling around him and just throwing out lines that are all about him being diagnosed with AIDS. And it shows really what was going through his head and is really that nightmarish effect of speech happening on stage. When it comes to abbreviated staccato speech, constantly throughout the show, we are taken back to the bars that Rich and Saul used to go to back at their cruising days, and when they were together, they would go to these as well. And in one instance, we are taken back to the bar, and here's just a little excerpt from the show that it shows this abbreviated staccato speech. This goes between a character called Clone 2, Rich, and Clone 1. Mirrors, shining, chains powerful, vitamins pure, condoms dildo, diet free, dungeon, acupuncture truthful, 10 inches, Tinfuron, beautiful, beer, water sports, asshole, hey, I'll kill ya. So as you can see, that just there's a back and forth of these abbreviated moments of speech that are taking place. And then when it comes to the abstract or exaggerated characters, as you heard me talk about just a second ago with abbreviated and staccato speech, there are characters that are named Clone 1, Clone 2, Doctor, Bartender, Hospital Worker, Nurse, Hospice Worker. So we see those elements of these abstract characters that just don't have a name like we saw in Mackinac with all the people in the office, especially and throughout the rest of the show. But what makes us different is that it's not all abstract or exaggerated characters. Like, for instance, we have Rich and Saul, who are the couple, Chet, which is the new ex lover, and Lily. So we still have some of those normal names for characters, which is treading on that line of realism and departing away back from this expressionistic idea. And then Within this show, we are looking at the emotional experience of a single character. Just like in Machinal, it was about the woman and her journey throughout this show. We are looking at Rich's life as he is diagnosed with AIDS, and it's a very tragic and emotional experience that we are taken on throughout this show, just as we were with Machinal, but dealing with this disease rather than an oppression of society. So in class, we talked about Machinal more as this expressionistic style, but I also saw the elements of epic theater in there, and I think that's very apparent too with As Is. I think it's more apparent in As Is than it was Machinal. Um, so in Machinal, we have this Brechtian approach, as you can see on the right. There's that alienation effect that keeps that audience at a distance and just keeps that onlook going on throughout the show, reminding them that they are watching a show and that this is not realism, so that they're taking a look at these characters and remembering what's happening on stage. We also saw double casting in the show by people playing multiple characters. And within Epic Theater, we talked about having that flawed hero. I don't necessarily think the woman was flawed, but because she was on trial for the murder of her husband, we see that complexity of the flaws that she has with the murdering of that husband. And now on the left, you can see that there's quite a few more ideas of epic theater that are happening in there. There's that Brechtian approach, again, with the alienation effect of keeping the audience at a distance. We're constantly pulled in and out of moments on stage where the scenes are overlapping and going right into the next one or going back in time, really shocking the audience in that moment. We see double casting again with characters on the stage playing multiple roles. We have this addition of like odd comedy throughout the show. Even though something serious is happening, there's that comedy in there that plays back into the Brechtian approach there. And something too about this show is that there's a narrator called the hospice worker, and she introduces the show with a monologue at the beginning and closes the show with a monologue at the end. Other than that, we never see this character again, but she sets the tone at the very beginning, talking about how her job is to lay people to rest when they're at their end, setting us up and telling us what the story is going to be about. And in the very end, she talks about some of the final days with Sal and Rich, and goes on to end on a lighter note about how she helped another person to his end by painting his fingernails at his very last breath. So I think that adds an addition of this epic theaterness of having that narrator that sets the tone and lets you know what you're about to watch. And then, as I mentioned before, we have freeze frames and tableaus that happen throughout this. We could be talking, and 1 minute we're in an apartment, and then someone says a line, and it takes us back in time as everyone else is frozen on stage, and we have this new sense of space on the stage happening at the same time, having that freeze frame in the background. And lastly, we have that flawed hero, just like Mackinac has with Rich. He's this complex character who's going through a lot, just like the woman in Mackinac. He's leaving his lover for a new lover who doesn't accept the fact that he has AIDS and doesn't want to be around him. And then he comes back to Saul, who is this one that's going to always take care of him. And he kind of uses that throughout this show to his advantage. And we just see kind of the flaws that he has of dealing with this idea that he has AIDS, such as at one point in the show, he talks about not even caring anymore and just going out and having sex and infecting anyone and everyone else around him. And now we're going to be taking a look at the two shows' agendas and comparing those two. Um, for both shows, when we talked about expressionism, there was a quote on a PowerPoint that said, "Look inside my head, my heart, my soul, and see how the world impacts me." In both of these shows, we are taking a look inside the eyes and head of exactly what our main characters are going through and the trauma that one of them is going through as an as is. We are seeing exactly how the world that they live in is affecting them and how they're viewing that world. There's a little bit of impressionism in here too, because you can kind of see in As Is and Mackinac how they see the world as well. But a lot of this has to do with that expressionistic approach of see how the world is impacting me here. So we see that when they're in these systems that are against them, for instance, the woman, we learned about in first wave feminism, just like, all these things that were against her and how that came together to form this outlook in this play. And then we see the AIDS epidemic, um, and the lack of support that went into figuring this out, and the world that lived in where Reagan wasn't addressing the AIDS epidemic, and how brutally honest it was in this show about how AIDS impacted Rich and how the world impacted around him, to show what it was like to go through what he was going through at the time. And then when it comes to both shows, we also talked about an epic theater, specifically with like Brecht, about how we estrange the audience, and we give a criticism on what's happening so that they take action to it. And I think with both of these shows, I'm going to start with As Is. Um, it estranges the audience and criticizes the lack of approach to the AIDS epidemic, like we talked about when we read Angels in America. Um, everything that happened in this play could have been solved earlier or sooner, or been helped sooner, so that Rich didn't have to go through what he went through with AIDS, and how it affected him because of Reagan's not approaching it. So it kind of criticized Reagan by showing the harsh reality of someone with AIDS during this time. And then from there, it provoked the audience to take action, to have Reagan speak on these things. And I think even reading it later in time, it just shows and creates that action within the reader about how we can't let this happen again. And I mean, if you look at the world now with COVID, I think this is a really good point to look at, about how it wasn't taken seriously to begin with, and we saw where it went because it wasn't taken seriously. So it has that modern dayness to it, by showing that when we don't criticize what's happening in the world and we don't take action because of this, it can happen again and again. And then with Machinal, we see the criticism of how women were treated in the world in the 1920s, and how the world affected them, and how everything was up against them because they were women, which created this idea of action that led to the first wave feminism, and has now led us, like we talked about in class, to that beginning of the fourth wave feminism that we're entering in now. So by reading and comparing these two plays, I've came down to two um, ideas, conclusion, whatever you want to call it. And one of them has to do with a school of thought based off of Tennessee Williams' Manifesto of Plastic Theater. But first, some ideas that I have is about the idea of oppression and its effect on art. Um, by reading both of these, we see how oppression of women, and the oppression of the gay community in general, and just like the lack of attention that it needed during that time, um, it created and allowed this art to be made. And although it's really sad and it's really tragic that it had to happen for this art to come out of it, I think it's interesting that in times of oppression, that um, it changes the world for those affected, but no one who isn't affected doesn't get to see the effect of that, and doesn't get to see the world, how it affects you. I mean, we talk about today, we have to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. As a white person, I will never experience oppression based on my skin tone. And I don't know what that world looks like outside of this whiteness that I have. And so, this idea that the oppression and the art combined together allows us to see this world as that person, even though we may never experience us in this life. And then, specifically looking at the expressionism side of this, I mean, it really puts on stage exactly how those characters are feeling. And I think it does really good for the other, and the other in the situation being the person that has never experienced this oppression and will never experience this oppression, will be able to see those effects real time on stage in front of them, and see how this world looks to those who are living in this oppression. So I just think it was really neat after reading these two, to see how people took the tragicness of life, and these systems that were against them, and all these terrible things that were happening, and we were able to put them into a story that conceptualized what it was like and what it looked like inside the mind of people living in these worlds, and put it on stage. And then I found this manifesto of Tennessee Williams, and based on my research, it was written kind of in the note of Class Menagerie, but it was expanded upon after. But this notion of plastic theater by Tennessee Williams, it really said that like expressionism and all other unconventional techniques in drama have only one valid aim, and that it is a closer approach to the truth. When a play employs unconventional techniques, it is not, or certainly shouldn't be, trying to escape its responsibility of dealing with reality or interpreting experience, but it actually or should be attempting to find a closer approach, a more penetrating and vivid expression of things as they are. And so I think that both of these shows really dive into this idea of plastic theater, and it was interesting because I've never heard of this before. With his manifesto, I'd never heard this mentioned. And it sounds like, based off of my research, that it was kind of really tied in closely to Expressionism, um, and with this idea of portraying life as it really is, but using those as a device of realism in a non-realistic setting. And I think that these two shows fall into this, and I think it would be interesting to see um, greater use of this technique on both of these shows to see really how it brings out more of the themes and the details that could easily be highlighted through this. Um, in plastic theater, there's a lot of music playing within the scene itself, and um, sometimes the character is able to hear it, and other times they're not able to hear it, and it's used to enhance mood. Um, and I know in both shows, specifically in Machinal, music and sounds are a part of the show to help with that distortion. And As Is, we have music playing at the clubs and stuff. And I think it would be interesting to see and talk with actors and as a director, look at this from this plastic theater example and figure out what sounds can you hear in this world and what sounds can you not hear, and how when we can hear them, how it affects us and affects the mood, and if we can't hear them, how might that affect the audience member watching in on the scene. And then another thing with plastic theater is that lighting is unrealistic and it calls for a dim light to evoke sense memory. Um, and in Expressionism, we talk about this idea of really bright and really dark contrast to make shadows and create this really harsh lighting effect. Um, and I think it would be cool to explore within these two pieces those moments when this effect of sense memory with lighting, while also keeping it in that unrealistic world view, would affect the show by figuring out which parts of the shows are memories. I mean, with Mackinac, it seems it's more like a whole memory itself. But within As Is, we have these moments where we are taken back in time, or the characters remember something. So using this effect um, to really bring back that sense memory and making it even up the ante possibly during the show. All in all, this plastic theater is more of a symbolic way of really showing the audience these inner workings of the character. And like I said, I think plastic theater and expressionism go hand in hand with each other. But I see that Tennessee Williams is really wanting to up that ante of really bringing to life the inner workings of these characters in a more technical aspect. And I think, like I talked about before, with the lighting and the music, and really symbolically showing the inner states of the characters into the physical space, would be just a small addition to both of these shows. But I think it would be really interesting to see how these slight tweaks affect both of them. And I think it could really enhance both of these shows.